Hello all, my name is Tab, and welcome to my YouTube channel. If you had to do a double take on this tank when you first saw it, please know you weren't the only one when it was first announced. It presents itself as a unique crossbreed between the French autoloaded tanks and the more traditional American tank designs. The store page for this tank even lampshades this, pointing out how this tank is actually pretty distinct for the relatively bland but effective tank design of post-World War II America. The T54 was released with patch 1.81 and was largely relegated to the sidelines, as this was the patch where helicopters were first released in the game. As such, I feel like this tank actually deserves a review. The T54E1 is actually a derivative of the American M48 main battle tank and is marked and marketed as a medium tank in the game. However, I think the T54 slots fairly well into American heavy tank gameplay and reminds me quite a bit of the M103 or T34 in the tech tree proper. As such, this tank lives and dies by its gun and demands proper usage of its gun and the mitigation of the flaws that this tank brings to its relatively high battle rating of 8.0. As with my last Should You Buy video, I'll use the armor triangle, protection, mobility, and firepower to judge the T54E1 and decide whether or not you should buy this tank. If you want to skip to my final conclusions on the T54E1, feel free to skip to this point of the video. Anyway, on to the actual review. For the T54, I'll start with the mobility. To say the least, it is not great. The T54 stat card reads that it can hit 43 kilometers per hour, and while that's certainly attainable, it takes an unrealistic amount of time for the tank to accelerate to this speed, even on paved roads. In combat conditions, the T54 hovers around 25 to 30 kilometers per hour, which is downright abysmal for a medium tank at 8.0. The T54 actually features the same engine as the entry M48 Patton, and while that tank can take advantage of its fairly powerful 810 horsepower engine, the T54E1 is a full 8 tons heavier than the M48 and brings the horsepower to ton ratio down to a mediocre 15. While that might not seem awful to lower tier tankers, when put against the mobility of other medium tanks at its BR, the T54 will consistently be behind its teammates in the opening of the match. For players like me who like to be aggressive and stay constantly pushing, this mobility can be a hindrance and makes a lot of early game rushes very unviable. For my first few games in this tank, I actually struggled to find places where I could effectively bring my gun to bear and actively contribute to the match. That's just a me issue though, and more cautious or newer players can actually turn this into a sort of advantage, as it does keep you from overextending at times. On the bigger maps though, this slowness can turn from a hindrance into an outright weakness, as getting around the map can take significantly more time than vehicles around the T54's battle rating. Even worse is when you're caught transitioning from one area of the map to the other, as crossing an open field in this tank can be lethal due to how long it can take to get from cover to cover. As such, caution should be taken to minimize time spent in the open, and you should generally stick to hard cover when possible. The reverse gear on this tank is okay, but not great, featuring only one reverse gear that clocks in at about 11 kilometers per hour. It's enough to get you around a corner in a pinch, but in most situations requiring a timely reverse, you tend to just die. A lack of any smoke at all in this tank also severely hinders the T54's ability to retreat, meaning that mistakes in this tank will be punished swiftly with no easy out for getting away from danger. The neutral steering is also rather average, and as such, keep aware of your teammates and your flanks in order to avoid situations where enemies can approach you unaware. Pretty much most movement in this tank should be premeditated, as the mobility is the one thing this tank lacks the most. Take it slow, but be sure to not be so slow that you are not helping your team. And at this tank's 8.0 battle rating, every player in the team counts, so be sure to help out the team as much as possible by being in the position where you can help your team the most. With the mobility done, now on to the armor of the T54. It's surprisingly good for an 8.0 medium tank. While it's not quite on par with proper heavy tanks like the IS-7 or even an IS-4, it features some trolley slopes and overlapping armor on the oscillating turret that can cause ricochets or even non-penetrations to most lower pinning shells. I have the most success against plain AP rounds, with most Soviet APHE and even more traditional solid shot tending to perform the worst against this tank's front armor arc. Even APDS can have the occasional bounce, as well as losing a lot of spalling on the overlapping plates. APF SDS and heat shells will still tear through you like butter though, and this is really problematic because of the T54's BR, most tanks will be slinging both these munitions like they're candy, so take caution when fighting tanks equipped with such rounds. For such an uncommon tank, I find that most players don't know where to shoot you, and as such they tend to put their shots in the more sloped or thickly armored parts of your turret, which can give you some much needed time to line up counter shots in enemy weak spots. However, don't rely on this exclusively, as if someone knows where to shoot you, it will be crippling due to this tank's extremely cramped turret. Thus, while this tank can benefit from its armor in a pinch, it should be treated as a last resort. In an up tier, play this tank like a medium tank with a fast reload. Support your team and knock out heavy hitters while not overexposing yourself. In a down tier, however, take advantage of the unique mix of truly armor and decent gun to be more aggressive than usual and deal heavy damage to the enemy, while right in their face. Lastly, I'll cover the firepower and gun handling of the T54E1. The immediate draw is the massive oscillating turret and autoloader, both of which are a key staple of the mid-tier French tank tree. This is incredibly unique because as of patch 1.91, it's the only oscillating turret in the American tech tree. And being an oscillating turret, this means that the T54's gun handling has a lot of weird quirks that can be quite annoying if you're not used to them. The first is that the turret itself is inherently unstable. The closest comparison is the M18 in the regular tree, as both of these tanks become pretty much impossible to fire accurately on the move, even when traveling slowly. And when stopping, the gun has a propensity to bob up and down for a second or two after braking, which can seriously harm your ability to react to enemies. A double downside is that at 8.0, your chances of fighting fully stabilized tanks is incredibly high, so your gun handling will get you killed quite often. And besides that, the gun handling itself is below average for an 8.0 tank. The turret rotation is a decent 17 degrees per second, which is on par with most other tanks at this BR. The lifting and lowering of the gun is an anemic 4 degrees, which when combined with a constant rocking of the turret, is just downright annoying to counteract. The gun depression elevation is also just okay, with both of them clocking it lower than average for an 8.0 tank. The gun handling is probably the biggest sore spot on this tank for me, as it hinders the most important part of this tank's armor triangle, the gun. The gun on this tank is an auto-loaded 105mm gun, which is also a unique feature for the US tech tree, as there's only a handful in the mainline tree as well. It features a nice variety of shells, with the ability to fire AP, APDS, and Heat FS. The shells share similar stats to other 105s at this tank's BR, with the Heat having slightly less penetration and the APDS having slightly more penetration than an L7 platform. If you use an L7 based gun, it feels pretty much identical in playstyle besides the ability to load AP shells. This is a fairly versatile complement, with the ability to engage a wide variety of threats with ease. While the AP seems good on paper, I've had mixed results with it, so I mainly stick to firing Heat, with a nice complement of APDS to back it up. The Heat is reliable, and can home break light vehicles now, which is pretty nice, while the APDS is for targets where the Heat struggles, such as the T55E1. The autoloader is the real boon of this tank, clocking in at a blistering 5-second reload. This is a phenomenal boost to the killing potential of this tank, being able to machine gun down tough targets or engage multiple targets at once. Be sure to be aware of your autoloader's ammo count, however, as you can fire the 9 shells inside before you realize that you need to reload them at all. Be sure to reload at least a few shells after each engagement, as it can take quite a bit of time if you're completely empty. One trick you can use to alleviate this problem is to sit on a friendly cap point, as reloaded shells instantly go into the rack and is significantly faster than waiting for your loader to do it. The gun really does carry this tank, and you should be cognizant of this fact before you buy the T54. It gives up major parts of the armor triangle to get the gun in the oscillating turret, and as such, it has a fairly steep learning curve that is compounded by its fairly high BR of 8.0. And despite my inner speed demon, my recommendation for this tank is to play with your team and be their fire support. Learn places where you can go to initially overwatch your teammates and cover their flanks, and as the match progresses, you can afford to be more aggressive and try to kill the lighter vehicles the enemies may respawn in. The lack of a stabilizer is brutal, and you should be extremely cautious in an up tier. You can still do good work, but let your teammates be a distraction while use your 5-second reload to cover them. So that hits on all the major pros and cons of the T54 in my opinion, but you open this video because you want to know if you should buy this vehicle. And like the OF40 vehicle, I'll split my recommendation into 4 parts. New players to War Thunder, experienced players who want to start a new tree, players who are looking for a boost in their tech tree research, and collectors who already have most tanks and are just looking for a good tank to stomp around in or a consistent SL grinder. Unfortunately, I have to call this tank a blanket no for the first 3 categories, which makes me sad considering I quite like this tank. The issue with this tank is that for new players, whether in general or trying to find a good grinder for the US tree, is that it's not forgiving or consistent enough to pick over the other 2 tier 5 American premiums, the T114 and the Magak. Both have better lineups to back them up, as well as being consistently good in both an up tier and down tier. The other issue, for players looking to build a lineup in 8.0, is that you'll face constant up tiers due to 8.7 being an incredibly meta BR. 8.7 tanks represent a major jump in capability, and you should look to progress them as soon as possible instead of trying to build an 8.0 lineup. For the collector, however, this tank is unique enough to look at buying, but I'd still give it a maybe. Try out the French auto-loaded tanks and use those as a gauge to see if you like playing this tank. Like always, think a bit before you buy this tank. And that wraps up both my recommendations and my review of the T54E1. If you like this video, please feel free to like and comment, and maybe even subscribe if you want to see more content like this. If you didn't like the video, please let me know what I could do better in the future. And as always, I'll take any and all advice for improvement. Anyway, I hope you guys all have a fantastic morning, day, or evening.